The glint of sunlight off a delicate gold chain caught Tariq Al-Hakim's attention as he sat in his Bentley outside the South Los Angeles Community Center, waiting for his business partner to conclude negotiations about a charitable donation that would provide tax benefits for his real estate empire. The 47-year-old Arab millionaire's breath caught in his throat when he saw the distinctive pendant hanging around the neck of a 14-year-old black girl who was walking toward the building's entrance. Because the intricate Arabic calligraphy and rare emerald centerpiece were unmistakable features of a necklace that had belonged to his daughter Yasmin before she disappeared from their Beverly Hills mansion 3 years earlier during a home invasion that had left his wife dead and his 8-year-old child missing without a trace. The sight of his daughter's most precious possession around a stranger's neck would lead to a revelation that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loss, survival, and the lengths to which a traumatized child would go to protect herself from a world that had already taken everything she had ever loved. The home invasion that had destroyed the Al-Hakim family had occurred on a Tuesday evening in March, when Tariq had been attending a business dinner in downtown Los Angeles, leaving his wife Layla and 8-year-old daughter Yasmin alone in their 20,000-square-foot mansion with only minimal security because they had felt safe in their exclusive Beverly Hills neighborhood. The 3 masked intruders had entered through a service entrance that had been left unlocked by a domestic worker whose background check had failed to reveal connections to organized crime, and their primary objective had been stealing valuable artwork and jewelry rather than harming the family members who had been sleeping peacefully upstairs. The criminals who had invaded their home had been part of a sophisticated network that targeted wealthy Middle Eastern families, using inside information about security systems, daily routines, and valuable possessions to execute burglaries that were supposed to be completed without violence or confrontation. Their expertise in avoiding detection and their knowledge of the house's layout suggested careful planning and surveillance that had extended over weeks or months before the actual break-in occurred. But when Layla had awakened to sounds of movement in the house and attempted to call police, the situation had escalated from burglary to violence, with the terrified mother being shot when she tried to protect her daughter from intruders who had not expected to encounter resistance during what was supposed to be a simple theft operation. The chaos that followed had separated Yasmin from her dying mother, and in the confusion of sirens, shouting, and police response, the traumatized child had somehow escaped the house and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a crime scene that would haunt investigators for years. The emergency response to the home invasion had been complicated by the mansion's size and remote location within the gated community, factors that had delayed police arrival and created opportunities for the traumatized child to flee undetected during the chaos of the initial investigation. The responding officers had been focused on securing the crime scene and pursuing the intruders, leaving insufficient resources to immediately locate a missing child who had vanished into the night. The search for Yasmin had consumed Tariq's life and fortune for 3 years, with private investigators, police detectives, and missing children organizations conducting an exhaustive investigation that had produced thousands of leads but no concrete evidence about what had happened to his daughter after she fled the house where her mother had been murdered. The assumption that she had been kidnapped by the home invaders had driven the initial search efforts, but as months passed without ransom demands or credible sightings, the investigation had expanded to consider possibilities, including human trafficking, murder, and accidental death that would explain her complete disappearance. The financial resources that Tariq had devoted to finding Yasmin exceeded $10 million, funding private investigative teams, reward programs, media campaigns, and specialized consultants who worked with families of missing children. The search had taken him across the United States and into Mexico, following leads that ranged from credible sightings to desperate hopes based on minimal evidence or wishful thinking. The psychological impact of losing both wife and daughter in a single traumatic event had transformed Tariq from a successful businessman into an obsessed parent whose only remaining purpose was finding his missing child. His real estate empire continued to generate enormous profits, but the wealth that had once provided security and satisfaction now served only to fund increasingly desperate search efforts that had taken him across the country and around the world, following false leads and impossible hopes. The support groups for parents of missing children that Tariq had initially joined had provided some comfort, But his inability to accept the possibility that Yasmin might be dead had eventually isolated him from other families who had learned to balance hope with grieving processes that allowed them to continue living, despite uncertainty about their children's fates. The necklace that had caught his attention outside the community center had been a gift for Yasmin's 8th birthday, commissioned from a master jeweler in Dubai, who had created the custom piece using Arabic calligraphy that spelled out her name in ancient script surrounding an emerald that had belonged to Tariq's grandmother. The design was unique and unmistakable, with specific details that would be impossible to replicate without access to the original documentation and photographs that police had used to identify the piece as evidence in their investigation. The significance of the necklace extended beyond its monetary value to represent the cultural heritage and family traditions that Tariq had been eager to share with his daughter, who had been beginning to show interest in Arabic language and Middle Eastern history during the months before the tragedy occurred. The pendant had been designed to grow with her, serving as a connection to her ancestors and a symbol of her identity that could guide her through the challenges of growing up as a mixed-race child in American society. The girl wearing the necklace appeared to be of mixed heritage herself, with features that suggested both African and Middle Eastern ancestry, though her dark complexion and street-smart demeanor made her seem completely different from the privileged 8-year-old who had disappeared from his Beverly Hills mansion. Her clothing was clean but inexpensive, and her wary posture suggested someone who had learned to be cautious around adults and suspicious of anyone showing too much interest in her personal affairs. The community center where she was heading served one of Los Angeles's most economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, providing after-school programs, job training, and social services for families who lacked resources that wealthier communities took for granted. The contrast between this environment and the exclusive Beverly Hills setting where Yasmin had grown up was so dramatic that it seemed impossible his daughter could have ended up in such circumstances. Yet the necklace's presence suggested connections that demanded investigation. Tariq's immediate reaction upon seeing the necklace was a mixture of hope, disbelief, and desperate urgency that made rational thinking difficult as he processed the implications of this potential breakthrough in his 3-year search for his daughter. The possibility that the necklace had simply been stolen and sold seemed most likely, but the remote chance that its presence might indicate Yasmin's survival created hope that he had not allowed himself to feel in months. The investigative protocols that his private security team had established for following leads required careful documentation and professional verification before pursuing direct contact with potential witnesses or suspects, but the emotional impact of seeing his daughter's necklace made systematic procedures seem impossibly slow and bureaucratic when immediate action might be necessary to prevent another disappearance. His hands shook as he reached for his phone to call the private investigator who had been coordinating the search efforts. But then he stopped as he realized that involving law enforcement or professional searchers might cause the girl to flee before he could approach her safely. The trauma that had apparently kept his daughter hidden for 3 years would not be overcome by official interventions or authority figures who might represent threats rather than help to someone whose experience with adults had included violence and betrayal. The decision to approach her directly required him to abandon the systematic search methods that had been consuming his resources for years and trust his parental instincts about how to reconnect with a daughter who might not remember him, or might be too traumatized to accept help from anyone claiming to represent her past. The emotional risks of such an approach were enormous, because failure could mean losing this opportunity and possibly driving her deeper underground, where even extensive search efforts might never locate her again. Tariq stepped out of his Bentley and began walking slowly toward the community center, his heart pounding as he tried to develop an approach strategy that would not frighten the girl who was wearing his daughter's necklace. His expensive suit and obvious wealth would mark him as someone from a different world, potentially triggering survival instincts that had kept her hidden for 3 years. So he needed to find ways to seem approachable rather than threatening to a teenager whose experience with adults had taught her to be suspicious of anyone claiming to want to help. The afternoon sun was creating harsh shadows on the concrete steps, where the girl had stopped to check something in her backpack, her movements efficient and purposeful in ways that suggested someone who had learned to be aware of her surroundings and prepared for various contingencies. The wariness in her posture was subtle, but unmistakable, to someone who had spent 3 years studying missing children cases and learning to recognize signs of trauma and survival adaptations. "Excuse me," he said gently as he approached the girl who was sitting on the steps outside the community center, trying to project friendly curiosity rather than the desperate hope that was making it difficult for him to maintain conversational composure. "That's a beautiful necklace you're wearing. The Arabic calligraphy is very skillfully done." The comment about the necklace caused an immediate defensive reaction, with the girl's hand moving protectively to cover the pendant, while her body language shifted into a posture that suggested preparation for flight if the situation became threatening. Her eyes, which had been avoiding direct contact with strangers as a survival mechanism, now focused on Tariq with the kind of suspicious assessment that street-smart teenagers use to evaluate potential dangers. "It's not for sale," she replied quickly, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who had learned that adults who showed interest in her possessions often had ulterior motives that involved taking things away from her rather than providing help or support. The defensive response confirmed that the necklace held special significance for her, which increased the likelihood that it was indeed the piece that had belonged to Yasmin, though it also suggested that direct questions about its origins might cause her to become even more guarded and potentially to leave before he could gather more information about how she had acquired it. "I'm not trying to buy it," Tariq said carefully, recognizing the defensive posture and trying to project reassurance rather than authority or threat. "I was just curious about where you might have gotten such a unique piece. The craftsmanship looks Middle Eastern, possibly Lebanese or Syrian." The specific knowledge he displayed about the necklace's origins created a different kind of tension, because most people who had noticed the pendant over the years had dismissed it as costume jewelry, rather than recognizing its cultural significance or artistic value. His ability to identify the regional style and craftsmanship suggested knowledge that went beyond casual observation to include familiarity with Middle Eastern jewelry traditions. The girl's reaction to his cultural expertise was complex, with her suspicious expression softening slightly as she processed the possibility that this stranger might have genuine appreciation for the necklace's heritage rather than simply coveting its monetary value. But her survival instincts remained alert, preventing her from lowering her guard completely, despite her apparent surprise at meeting someone who understood the pendant's cultural significance. "Someone gave it to me a long time ago," the girl replied evasively, her survival instincts preventing her from providing information that might lead to questions about her background or current circumstances. Though something about the man's respectful tone and genuine interest in the necklace's cultural significance had prevented her from immediately walking away from the conversation. The vague reference to receiving the necklace as a gift could be interpreted multiple ways, from theft to legitimate inheritance, but Tariq's growing suspicion that this might be his daughter made him reluctant to push for details that might cause her to flee. The careful way she spoke suggested intelligence and education that seemed inconsistent with her apparent circumstances, adding another layer of mystery to her identity and background. Tariq's careful observation of the girl's facial features and mannerisms was beginning to reveal subtle similarities to characteristics he remembered from Yasmin's childhood, despite the dramatic changes that 3 years of aging and different life circumstances had created in her appearance. The shape of her eyes, the way she held her head when listening, and subtle gestures that he remembered from her childhood were becoming visible beneath the defensive postures and street-smart behaviors that had been necessary for her survival. The possibility that this could be his daughter was both thrilling and heartbreaking, because the transformation from privileged 8-year-old to wary teenager suggested experiences and hardships that no child should have had to endure. The protective instincts that had driven his 3-year search were now complicated by recognition that approaching her too aggressively might recreate the kind of threatening adult behavior that had taught her to hide from people who claimed to want to help. "The Arabic writing on the pendant," he continued, his voice beginning to tremble as he processed the growing evidence that this conversation might be the culmination of his desperate search. "It looks like it might be someone's name. Do you know what it says?" The question created visible internal conflict for the girl, because acknowledging that she could read the necklace's inscription would reveal education and cultural knowledge that might lead to questions about her background that she had been carefully avoiding. Her hand moved protectively over the pendant again, but her eyes remained focused on Tariq's face, as if searching for clues about his motivations and potential trustworthiness. The tension that followed his question was palpable, with both of them aware that the conversation had moved beyond casual interest to something more personal and potentially dangerous. The girl's survival instincts were clearly warring with curiosity about this stranger, who seemed to understand her necklace in ways that no one else had during her years of hiding, while Tariq struggled to balance his desperate hope with recognition that pushing too hard might end his only chance of reconnecting with his lost daughter. "Maybe," she said quietly, her hand still protectively covering the pendant, while her eyes searched Tariq's face for clues about his motivations and potential threats. "Why do you want to know?" The direct question forced Tariq to make a choice between the cautious approach that professional searchers had recommended and the emotional honesty that his paternal instinct suggested might be necessary to reach a daughter who had been hiding from the world for 3 years. The risk of revealing his identity too quickly could frighten her away, but continuing to pretend casual interest felt like a betrayal of the love and desperation that had driven his search efforts. The moment stretched between them like a bridge across 3 years of separation and pain, with Tariq realizing that his next words would either begin the process of reuniting his family or confirm that hope could be more cruel than despair. The girl's expression showed wariness mixed with something that might have been longing, as if part of her wanted to trust this stranger who seemed to understand the significance of her most precious possession. "Because," he said, his voice breaking as tears began to flow, "I think that necklace belongs to my daughter Yasmin, and I think you might be her." The words hung in the air between them, like a revelation that challenged everything both of them had believed about identity, survival, and the possibility of families being reunited after traumatic separation. The girl's reaction was immediate and dramatic, with her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble as memories and emotions that she had suppressed for years suddenly demanded recognition and response. The recognition that passed between them in that moment transcended the physical changes that trauma and time had created, as father and daughter finally acknowledged the truth that both had suspected but neither had dared to believe. The 3 years of separation, survival, and desperate searching had led to this moment of reunion that would begin the long process of healing wounds that had seemed too deep to ever fully mend. "Baba," she whispered, using the Arabic word for father that she had not spoken since the night her world had been destroyed, her voice carrying 3 years of pain, fear, and desperate hope that someone who loved her might still be searching, despite the impossibility of finding someone who had worked so hard to remain hidden. The single word contained all the love, loss, and longing that had defined both their lives since the night that violence had torn their family apart, confirming not just her identity, but also the survival of the emotional bonds that had connected them despite years of separation, and the profound changes that trauma had created in both their lives. The reunion that followed was careful and gradual, with both of them aware that the trauma and separation had created wounds that would require time and patience to heal. Yasmin's survival instincts made it difficult for her to trust anyone completely, even the father she had missed desperately, while Tariq struggled to balance his joy at finding her with his grief about the experiences that had transformed his innocent 8-year-old daughter into a streetwise teenager who had learned to survive on her own. The revelation that the girl he had approached was indeed his missing daughter created a mixture of overwhelming joy and devastating sorrow, as he realized that Yasmin had been alive and struggling for survival just miles from his Beverly Hills mansion while he had been searching for her around the world. The proximity of her hiding place to their former home suggested that she had remained in the Los Angeles area despite the extensive local search efforts that had failed to locate her. The psychological journey of rebuilding their relationship required professional help and family therapy that addressed both the initial trauma of the home invasion and the secondary trauma of 3 years of survival without family support. Yasmin's selective amnesia about some events had been a protective mechanism, but recovering her complete identity and history required carefully processing memories that had been too painful to integrate during her years of focusing on immediate survival needs. The transformation that Yasmin had undergone during her years of hiding included not just physical changes, but also psychological adaptations that had enabled her survival but made reintegration into family life challenging. Her habits of secrecy, hypervigilance, and emotional self-protection had been necessary for staying safe on the streets, but created barriers to trusting the security and love that Tariq wanted to provide. The legal complexities of her disappearance and unofficial foster care placements required months of paperwork and court proceedings to resolve. But Tariq's wealth and legal resources made it possible to navigate bureaucratic obstacles that might have prevented other families from reuniting under similar circumstances. The private investigators and search specialists who had been working on her case for 3 years were amazed by the chance encounter that had accomplished what systematic search efforts had been unable to achieve. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing. So this channel, now back to the story. Years later, when Yasmin had completed college and began working with organizations that helped missing and exploited children, she would reflect on the afternoon when her father had recognized her necklace and spoken the words that had ended her years of hiding and begun the process of reclaiming her identity and family relationships. The necklace that had connected them across 3 years of separation had become a symbol of resilience, love, and the power of family bonds to survive even the most traumatic circumstances. The story of how a father's recognition of his daughter's necklace had led to an impossible reunion became a testament to the enduring power of parental love and the remarkable resilience of children who could survive unimaginable circumstances while maintaining connections to their true identities, despite years of necessary disguise and self-protection.